Hello and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association, the show where we talk about all things Gothic, pop culture and history. We are, of course, your Ghoul Guides. My name is Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are going back to the sort of 2nd, 3rd and 4th century. But we're talking about something slightly different. We're not talking about the Goths this time. We are, in fact, talking about the Romans. And this is a much awaited episode by me.
And me.
And you. Thank you. Thank
Yes.
you for always supporting me in my obsessions and passions.
Yes. Always.
Always. So this is an episode all about Mithras, a Roman Empire era cult mystery god of variety of different things: sun, war, contracts, all sorts of things, but a fascinating sort of insight into the late Roman Empire, into the establishment of Britain as we know it now, and one of the kind of cult mystery gods that has inspired a lot of not necessarily Gothic texts in the like direct sense, but I think has really shaped fantasy as a genre, has shaped the Gothic's obsession with symbology and the hidden, and particularly the idea of subterranean cults and occultism. So, we are talking about Mithras. Yay.
The one and only.
The one and only. So a little bit of context here that Mary knows. Mithras is one of my weird autistic obsessions that was born out of my Arthurian obsession, which I mentioned on a recent episode. And that's because in a book series by a writer called Mary Stewart called The Crystal Caves, which are a reimagining of the Merlin stories, that imagines that Merlin, the Welsh prince, is in fact the son of a Roman Britannic, so Brittany, not Britain, military leader, who in this imagining is the older brother of Uther Pendragon, who is coming to try and reclaim his throne in Britain. The first book is kind of like Merlin as a child, then Merlin as an adult, the birth of Arthur, and then the final bit of the legend and, you know, Nimue and things like that. So you might be thinking, what the fuck does this have to do with a Roman cult god? And that's because Merlin's father and his uncle are Mithras worshippers. And in the books, Merlin is indoctrinated into the cult of Mithras. And being 13, 14, I was like, who the fuck is Mithras? Never heard of this guy. And it being sort of like 2002, I went to the library and looked up who Mithras was. And then got really obsessed with it.
Old-fashioned, you know, hard, but thoroughly like
searching.
enjoyable research. If you haven't been to your library in a while or ever, then now is your reminder that, you know, libraries are a really good resource and you can find out lots of stuff there, including about Mithras.
We got an awesome new library in Nottingham a few years ago, and I took Mary and we had a great day.
They're really
two
fun.
nerds in the library.
You can go hang out, you can find loads of books, you can work there, they often have cafes. A lot of them either have spaces where you can work on your laptops or they have computers. And yeah, like obviously like this episode is going to have lots of information about Mithras. So maybe you'll want to research something else, or maybe this will kind of whet your appetite and you'll want to dive in more into the cult of Mithras.
Yeah.
But yeah,
let's start a new one.
Yeah, enough praise about libraries. Lauren, let's get into Mithras.
Get into the story. Okay, so Mithras, or the Cult of Mithras, as I said, was a late Roman cult worship deity. And we have talked about what that means before, but I will explain it a little bit shortly. And if you are a bit of a mythology, ancient history fan, you might not actually have heard of Mithras because he is not part of the what I would maybe call like the core canon of the Roman deities. He is a late
he's not on the cool kids table.
He's not on the cool kids table. He's like the young upstart. I'm trying to think of like a good analogy and I can't. Um
It's like, when you're at, like, secondary school or high school, and you've got, like,
mhm.
people in, like, year 11 or maybe, like, sixth form. I
Yeah.
don't know what the equivalent of that would be in,
Whatever it
America,
is
but,
when you're
like,
in like
16,
17.
17, 18, yeah, and you've kind of established, like, this is
Mhm.
how, like, the popular kids go, and this is what we do, and who we are, and where we sit, and everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, they're so cool," and, you know, maybe there's cheerleaders, maybe there's jocks, maybe, all those kinds of people. And then there's
Mhm.
someone that comes in year 7 who just does not give a fuck. And they're like, you know, I'm going to do things my way. And then everyone else in the school is kind of like, well, that's kind of fresh.
Now,
Oh,
excuse me.
yeah. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. That works
Yeah.
perfectly. So, as with many Roman deities, Mithras is an appropriated deity. So, if you didn't know, one of the things that Rome did to make themselves successful as an empire that spanned a huge amount of the European, Asian, and African subcontinent is that they appropriated local deities into the Roman canon and tradition. And this is something that the Byzantine Empire later did with Christianity. They appropriated local pagan traditions into the Christian faith, into the Christian religion, and to the calendar. And it helped essentially then homogenize those additions to the empire. So Mithras actually is a Persian or what we would now consider to be Iranian god. And in Persian, I believe he is actually called Mithra, so without that S on the end, which is, pretty similar. Some of the gods had complete name changes, like Zeus becomes Jupiter, Ares becomes Mars, Aphrodite becomes Venus, so on and so forth. But in this case, Mithra, the Persian god of the sun, of justice, of contracts, and of war, becomes the Roman Mithras. So, if you know much about Persia, in the kind of around about, I think, like first and second centuries, they become a largely Zoroastrian nation. And this is a faith that still persists today. A lot of Iranian people and a lot of Persian descent people still follow the Zoroastrian faith, and it is slightly older than Christianity. But Mithras was a pre Zoroastrian god. So round about the first century BCE, the Romans had a lot of interactions with Persia. There was some kind of overlapping of territory, and Mithras became increasingly popular in Rome. Now, by about the first century CE, Mithras had almost been completely detached from his Persian origins. So, even though the Roman Mithras shared a lot of similarities with the Persian Mithra, still a sun god, still a war god, there was a lot around things like loyalty. The Roman Mithras became more of a god of loyalty, war, and contracts in the sense of being loyal to the emperor and to the Roman Empire. So this is another one of those things where I look back and think, was I always going to become a war scholar? Because Mithras is an incredibly militaristic deity, and he was primarily worshipped by soldiers. So in Mary Stewart's The Crystal Cave series, her Merlin series, the soldiers in Marcus Aurelius, not that Marcus Aurelius, in Marcus Aurelius's army are all part of this Mithras mystery cult. And it's the values of Mithras, the hierarchy, the ideas. I'll talk a little bit about the worship in a moment, that kind of brings and binds these soldiers together. So this was a very, very militaristic religion, and the worship was very militaristic itself. And I say religion because, being a mystery cult, it is, encouraging worship to a single deity. Like I say, I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But yeah, very, I think, poignant that this is something that, as the Roman Empire is spreading, and you've got soldiers from Africa, Britain, Gaul joining the Roman legions, that there is this style of worship and practice of worship that is very fraternal, that is also then militaristic. And when we think about military fraternity, that's something that runs right through up into, well, it still happens today. So it's kind of like a secret society. And we have talked before about why secret societies are so gothic. But it wasn't quite a secret society in the sense of it being very exclusive. It's actually a very large religion. And some scholars have suggested that, had things gone slightly differently, we could all be living in a world where Mithraism is the dominant religion.
I mean, I always say that we are living in the stupid timeline. And I think I wonder, when you're like, "Oh, what's the hinge point for this?" And I normally always go back to like 2000. Obviously, there's stupid things that happened
Mhm.
before that, but 2000, where, with my own obsessions into American politics, where Al
Yep.
Gore
Mhm.
um wins the
The
popular
Democratic
vote of
primary.
the well, he wins the popular vote of
Oh,
the
popular
presidential
vote. Yeah,
election,
yeah,
and then technically he also wins the
yeah.
electoral
Yeah.
college, but because of the Supreme Court ruling, and
George.
basically
Oh
saying
dear.
that George W. Bush, there was some counts and recounts that were going on in Florida, under one of the then officials, another what's his brother called? I forget now. The embarrassing
What?
Bush. Um,
Oh God, what is
uh,
W's brother
I don't
called?
know
The other one.
the other one that tried to become the nominee when Trump
Yeah.
first got into that primary. But
I
anyway,
cannot
he
remember
was
his
like
name.
he was someone in Florida, and they did all those that stuff, and then basically
Mhm.
Democrats are so polite, and they're like, well, okay, fine. The Supreme Court has said that George W. Bush is the president, so I guess he's president now. And that's always been for me like the kind of hinge point where it's like, this is where we're in the stupid timeline, because that's really stupid. But maybe it's actually like earlier. Maybe it goes all the way
Yeah.
back, and like maybe there's actually a timeline where Mithraeans, Mithrites,
Mithraism. Mithrites.
Mithrites,
Mithrists, maybe?
Mithrists, and I don't know. I mean, I guess we can uncover whether or not we think that
Mhm.
timeline would be any better than the one that we're in now. As you kind
Yeah.
of you talk us through the worship and the ideals.
Knowing
Um,
what I do about militaristic societies, I don't know that it would have been much better, but
yeah.
we can debate that later. So, Mithraism in the Roman tradition was incredibly popular between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, but went into rapid decline after the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine kind of really homogenized Christianity across the Roman Empire. And as we've talked about previously, we have that transition to the Byzantine Empire, and it is a Christian empire. So, people like Justinian that we talked about, who were establishing what would become the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, things like that, and those kind of like major ideas of Christianity. But yeah, some scholars have sort of suggested that, had things gone slightly differently, that kind of round about the 3rd century CE, Mithraism was popular enough to rival Christianity. And that as the Roman Empire was going through that period of decline and evolution, that you know, it almost would have been a toss of the coin of which one was going to become the dominant religion.
But
But
again, like if you do believe in like alternate timelines and
mhm,
multiverses and stuff, there is
yeah,
surely one where
there's
that choice,
absolutely,
that coin
yeah,
toss landed the other
yeah,
way.
I think so. I think there's absolutely another parallel universe where the we are all like, well, not all of us, because not all of us are Christian, but like where Mithraism became the dominant religion,
Yeah.
um, over Christianity, and I
We'd
think
be
that would
getting ready for Mythmas.
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 Uh,
Mithras
yes,
Mass?
we would.
Yeah.
Mithras. So who was Mithras? So we know that Mithras existed in the Persian canon, in the Persian pantheon, at least around the 15th century BCE, if not earlier, and that Mithras was quite a considerable deity in that tradition. There's like tablets that kind of invoke Mithras's name of like in treaties between different nations, and his imagery and his appearance is quite popular in a lot of sort of pre-Zoroastrian, pre-Christian Persian um, art, architecture, so on and so forth. So he's usually depicted in a Phrygian cap, um, which is quite interesting. I'm not sure if maybe that became more popular in the Roman era, but usually in a Phrygian cap, which
Can
isn't
you describe this cap?
it's a Smurf cap.
Okay. Great.
It's the Smurf hat. If you're not sure
Okay,
what a
yeah.
Phrygian cap is, it's the Smurf hat. And it has a lot of different meanings and connotations in art history and in mythology, usually to do with certain things around like logic and wisdom, that I assume was a conscious decision to put the Smurfs in it, but I don't know enough about the Smurfs
Maybe
um,
these Smurfs
to
are
judge that.
also part of the Mithras cult.
Maybe they are blue,
Mm.
and they are
Yeah,
largely male. There's only one girl,
yeah, yeah,
you know, so it is also a very patriarchal religion. So maybe so,
yeah.
mayhaps that could be our next research project.
Yeah, yeah.
So as I said, Mithras was the god of, or Mithra in this case, was the god of contracts, loyalty, diligence, war, the sun. And the Romans kind of appropriated him as a sun god. And there's some evidence that the Greeks didn't necessarily worship Mithras or have Mithras in their canon, but were sort of like aware of him. And the Romans kind of make him into a god that is connected to the emperor. So there's this kind of thing of like, if Mithras is the god of like war and loyalty and justice and contracts, then it makes sense that he's also like the god of like whoever is at the top of that leadership hierarchy. And hierarchy does seem to have been very important in Mithraism. So there's some scholars that kind of suggest that like you know, he was like a god of emperors and therefore like you know, generals, counselors, or kings, you know, if it was kind of like legion states and things like that, or if we're thinking about a military sense, like your general would be the head of your chapter, and then like, you know, it would go down in the command and things like that. So the Roman Mithras is definitely, as I said, explicitly taken from the Persian Mithra, and both his imagery and his, um, you know, ideologies and things like that, very much taken from it. So Mithras is usually depicted as being born kind of from a rock underground, and being the bringer of light. So there being an element of the sun god to his actual birth. And you've got that kind of idea of like a spontaneous divine birth. So he is not necessarily the offspring of two other deities, although in some like stories he maybe is. So he bursts to life from this rock, and in almost every single image of Mithras, he is slaying the sacrificial bull. And usually the bull's head is kind of pulled to the side, looking away, and Mithras is looking out, like as if towards the sunrise, kind of thing. He has his like Phrygian cap. There's often symbology around the side of his, murals and temples and things that relate to the celestial bodies and star signs, which is it would make a lot of sense in terms of the Roman appropriating it from the Persian tradition. There was a lot of astrology happening, and yeah, this sacrificial bull is a huge part of Mithras's lore and tradition. And I'm going to try and say this correctly. It is called tauroctony. Tauroctony. So,
Okay.
like Taurus, taureau,
Yeah,
bull.
yeah.
Um, tauroctony, which I believe is literally taken from the Greek word that means bull killing, which I think is
And
tauroctonos.
how is he killing this bull? Because I mean, it is very impressive to kill a bull. They are big animals. They're also quite, vicious and ferocious. I'm
Mhm.
assuming he does this on his own. That's also part of his like
Yes.
accomplishment. But is
Yeah.
he doing it with like any weapons, or is it just like literally his bare hands and his core strength?
Yes. So Mithras has a couple of sort of like sacred images in terms of like his cap, the bull, and also like the dagger or the knife that he's using. So
Hmm.
usually he's holding the bull by one of its horns and pulling its head back, and he's either stabbing or
Mm.
like slitting the throat of the bull. I'm not a an ancient or a classics scholar. I know there is some um deeper meaning to this specific way of slaying the bull,
It's very
in terms of
sacrificial.
divinity.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's
it
very
is
sacrificial,
specifically
and
sacrificial.
yeah, you'll find, like, in a lot of, like, ritual kind of, like, um, animal sacrifices that there will be a specific way to kill an animal, and it will be, in that kind of,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah, that kind of way.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So being a cult religion, there is quite a lot of debate over what this slaying of the bull means. Some of it is, kind of obvious. So you often have, like there's a bowl to catch the blood, and there's like the image, like I said, the celestial bodies around the outside, and it's all about like death and rebirth
Yeah.
and the
Well, I mean,
sun and
if we're comparing it to Christianity,
mhm,
which does have a lot of, I mean, obviously there is also a lot of animal sacrifice in like Roman and Greek
yes.
mythology, but I know them less well.
Yes,
But
same.
if you're thinking about this in terms of like Mithras versus Christianity in term and thinking about that coin toss and which
Mhm.
would have won out, obviously in Christianity you have building on that image of the lamb and lambs and
Yeah.
animal sacrifice in Judaism, the idea that the binding of
Mhm.
Isaac, where Isaac is taken up to a rock by his father. God tells him, you have to kill Isaac, and then at the
Mhm.
very last minute, he's like, "Wait, no, I'm not gonna. I don't want you to kill your son. Actually, I've never asked you to do that. Kill this animal instead." So then, for ages, like for centuries, you had this idea of like you would kill an
Yeah.
animal to give sacrifice to God. But then the idea of Jesus coming in and being like, "Hello, I am the Son of Man, and I will be killed, and therefore you don't have to do animal sacrifice anymore." Which is
Mhm.
why there's not any like ritual kind of methods or that kind of like killing
Yes.
or like animal kind of things in
Yeah.
Christianity. So you have those two images side by side, the kind of like the lamb, then into like the god man,
Yes.
um kind of replacing animal sacrifice, and then you have this, here's this giant massive bull, and
Mhm.
it's not a lamb, it's big, and it's a display of power and masculine strength,
Yeah.
um and yeah, so i
Yeah,
think i think
and
those are two really interesting like opposing images.
yeah, and the bull had a very specific role in pre-Christian Europe. We know about like the Mycenaeans, but bulls appeared throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the Persian Empire, in Greece, as this kind of, like often sacrificial idea, because bulls were kind of one of the the biggest, the most brutish, but also in a lot of ways the most majestic, and we get the idea of the sublime a lot in the bull.
Hmm.
So the sacrifice of the bull, the overcoming of the bull, is that thing about embracing godliness, manliness, so on and so forth. So in the Roman tradition, some scholars have argued that Mithras was interpreted in a more Platonic ideal, and by that I don't mean friendly, I mean literal Plato, the philosopher.
Oh,
um,
that guy.
that guy. So some scholars have argued that the sacrifice, that Mithras overcoming the bull, the sacrifice of the bull, it taking place in a cave. So Mithras, the idea is Mithras is born in the cave from the rock. He leaps out, he slays the sacrificial bull, and brings light to the world, or whatever it might be, like takes the sun up out from the cave. But this is a very subterranean ideal. So we have a god of the sun being born under the ground, slaying the sacrificial bull, and then taking his divine position. So it does make sense, even from my very limited understanding of Greco-Roman philosophy, that this idea from Plato's Republic about the cave, and I'm not going to tell the cave story because I understand it, but I don't understand it. I am not a philosopher. But that idea that there was a parallel between Plato's cave and that idea of knowledge of self, of light, of what light means, and the Mithras story. And some have suggested that Mithras was equated with a figure that you might know some stuff about. I'm not sure. The demiurge.
I'm gonna say no, but
Okay.
maybe if you tell me some things, then it might like jog my
Yes. Okay.
memory.
So the demiurge is an idea that is discussed in Plato's The Timaeus. And it is the text, I believe, and the concept that goes on to form Gnosticism.
Okay.
So in Gnosticism, the idea is that there is an all being, all knowing God, and that there is then the world essentially is covered by a firmament that is like a fake sky. And I'm trying to make sure I remember what's actually from Gnosticism and what's from Genshin Impact, which borrows pretty much
Yeah.
all of the Gnostic lore and like the Gnostic Gospels. But basically, the idea is that the demiurge is like a fake god, that was either created or born, usually from an egg. I believe not necessarily a product of the true God, but is a very powerful being, but is not actually the true all knowing, you know, all being God. And therefore, the demiurge has like fallibility and is like good and evil. And the demiurge creates the world, creates the firmament around the world, so like the fake sky. And that the reason that good and evil and that like humans do bad things and so on and so forth in Gnosticism is this idea that the God of this world is not the true God. Um, so that's kind of like, I hope I've done that justice, the Gnostic idea. And if you would like an episode on Gnosticism, then let us know, because Gnosticism is something that has really informed a lot of like Gothic weird fiction, things like H.P. Lovecraft, the idea of like an evil god. It even comes up in Mary Shelley's Valperga. So let us know if you want an episode on that, and I will actually go back and find my, first year undergraduate notes. But some scholars have argued that as this sort of later, we're talking late Roman Empire, really, this later deity coming, in this Platonic ideal from the underground, that, yeah, basically, Mithras was the Platonic demiurge, so the kind of pre-Gnostic, or the Gnosticism is kind of evolving around the same time. So in a lot of the Mithras representations, you have the four elements. You have this idea that before Mithras, there's this darkness, and then Mithras is born from the cave, and the stars appear and the celestial beings appear, and all of this kind of stuff. And this idea about like the soul and creation. Yeah, you have the planets, like the celestial bodies. So it is definitely quite a different Roman concept, because the kind of core Roman pantheon is very much taken from the Greek pantheon, and you have the idea of the family of gods, of demigods, of different types of beings. So Mithras is really interesting, because if you think about the fact that this is a religion that's starting in parallel to Christianity, it has not necessarily the same concepts, because it's a lot more obviously it's not Judaic, it's a lot more kind of supernatural in that sense. It's weird to say that, because everything, it wasn't supernatural, it was just divine. But yeah, it's got a lot of very similar ideas. You've got a god that's bringing light to the world, that's bringing human souls, that has this kind of idea of like, a god that is bringing like humans,
It's moving
yeah.
it's moving away from a pantheon and into
Yes.
something like, not exactly, but like a monotheism, which is one of the things that Judaism did do, and then obviously Christianity did as well.
Mhm.
Obviously, there are still traces in the text of the earlier, um,
Mhm.
uh, Mediterranean pantheons. But that's one of the things with the codified religions, especially, where it's moving into this more like this is not just your Apollo figure who is the kind
Yes.
of at the top of the table of a big
Mhm.
family. This is more like there's one main guy
Yeah.
and he's in charge, and also he's associated with creation and light
Mhm.
and strength. um
Yeah.
and yeah, so there will be differences, but I guess it all kind of stems from that idea of
Yeah.
there being one main god.
Yes. So if this has all sounded a bit confusing, basically the idea is that Mithras springs to life from the cave. He slays the sacrificial bull, and in slaying the bull, he brings life and light and, essentially everything to the world, and he established all of these principles. And he puts, brings human souls down from heaven, and the stars come to life, and they do a really, really good job of demonstrating this myth at the London Mithraeum in a really beautiful kind of light show. And I'll talk a little bit about the Mithraeum in a minute. But it is debated whether or not sacrifices ever actually happened in the Cult of Mithras. Some scholars think yes, but I would say that most seem to agree that it probably never happened. Partially because the Mithraeums we have aren't that big. They're underground. It seems to have been more a symbolic idea, and we know that masks and initiations all happened kind of with the tradition. So it may be there was a sort of, the new initiate might be the bull or something like that has kind of been suggested. But essentially, there's this idea of death and rebirth in the slaying of the sacrificial bull, and this idea of transcendence. And that seems to be where a lot of the meaning was coming from for the Roman cult religion. So, although, as I said, definitely an appropriation, no means a new concept, it, like I said, pretty detached pretty quickly from its origins. So, whilst the Persian Mithra had always had this element of subterranean worship, um, the Romans really embraced it. And I think that's because it really gelled with the Roman militaristic society. Because at this point, Rome is, the greatest empire ever known to man. If you're listening, I'm rolling my eyes. Um, so, having a militaristic tradition, having a militaristic concept, is really, really important. You cannot sustain a large scale empire if you do not have loyal soldiers. And one of the ways that you maintain loyal soldiers is by going to your conquered African nations, your conquered Asian nations, and saying, would you like to be a general? If you do well as part of your spoils of war, you will become Roman and I will give you territory. And this is why we get Black Roman emperors. We get Roman emperors like Justinian, whose uncle starts out as a peasant and is so successful as a soldier that he becomes the emperor. And I know that's Byzantine, and I said last time it's technically not Roman, but it works for my argument, okay? So I think it makes a lot of sense that at this point in time, particularly the more militaristic portions of the Roman Empire are moving away from the pantheon and towards this almost monotheistic idea of Mithras, because it is a bonding experience. And in nationalism, theories around nationalism and nation, one of the things that we talk about quite a lot is that to have a national identity, you have to have a connecting narrative. That if you don't have a connecting narrative, you cannot have a nation. How do you have a connecting narrative in something as big as the Roman Empire? Something like Mithras and the worship of Mithras, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially because it's a tradition that was, historically encouraging the worship of the king or the emperor and loyalty and, contracts. Being a soldier is a contract. That is what, it's I swear allegiance, I swear oath. That's why in those medieval romances, you have the bending of the knee and the sworn oath, and why it was so important if someone swore allegiance. And to break allegiance was, essentially to condemn your mortal soul. It was like one of the worst things you could possibly do was to break your allegiance as a soldier, or as a general. So I think it makes a lot of sense that at the same time you've got a lot of people, around about like the first, second century, we've got a lot of people turning to Christianity, and rejecting this vast, confusing pantheon of gods who do terrible things and feel very chaotic and confusing. That you've also got people turning to Mithras, who seems to fit this Platonic ideal as well. Like, if we think about like the Enlightenment and the spread of Protestantism in the Enlightenment, I feel like it's kind of parallel to what must have been happening in the second and third centuries.
Yeah,
Maybe
for
that's a big
sure.
claim.
Well, it's like the spread of anything though, where it's offering kind of community and belonging. Like, come
Mhm.
and join us, and you can come into our caves or into our underground kind of spaces and be part in a ritual. And I mean, as soon as you
Mhm.
were like, maybe there were masks, I was like, yeah, that sounds like absolutely what like soldiers, especially men, would be like. Yeah, I'm gonna hang out with my buddies. We'll do a little ritual, be really kind of spooky and secret,
Yep.
and we'll
Mhm.
get dressed up with our masks. I think
Yes.
that sounds very in a similar way to Protestantism, or even like the early spread of
Mhm.
Christianity, where it's like, come into this church and like here we like have
Mhm.
this bread, have this wine. And I guess the kind of appeals are different in that it's like, on the one hand you have, if Jesus loves you, and if you've done wrong, then he will forgive you and you will
Mhm.
get into heaven. Whereas here, what you have is this kind of celebration of military might and
Yeah.
loyalty, and it's kind of like
Mhm.
the bull at the center of it, which is he has accomplished this big feat, and like you in the military could also accomplish big feats, and it
Yes.
might not be killing a
And that
bull,
that, like,
but that's where the metaphor comes
brings
from.
yeah, and
Yeah,
that brings light and, you know,
and
like I said,
glory,
Platonic
and
ideal to the
yeah,
world. And I
yeah,
think it is really interesting that we've got two budding religions that both have death and rebirth as a really
yeah.
central concept. So yeah, so in case you're wondering, what on earth is a mystery cult when it's at home?
Yes, yes.
So when when we talk about cult religions, mystery cults in the pre-Christian or kind of like dominant Christian era, what we are talking about is not necessarily a cult like you would think of it today. Um, Although, as you might have guessed, there was secret meetings, initiations, masks, and things like that, but you weren't necessarily hiding that you were an initiate of Mithras. Maybe later on, so in, in the Merlin books, there's this whole thing about they have to hide that they're worshipping Mithras because Christianity is becoming the dominant religion. And as Mithraism fell out of favor, it would have been, like any pagan religion, seen as heathenism. So it's unclear whether or not Mithraism did last that long. It's kind of one of those things a bit like Druidism, where because of the nature of like the oral storytelling and the oral initiations, like we don't necessarily have the written records that we do for things like the Oracle of Delphi. Like we don't have the records in the same way. But essentially, a cult religion in the pre-Christian tradition was um, a group of people coming together to worship a specific god of the pantheon. And there was usually it was more like a religious school of thought. So a very specific theology with specific values. And there was usually initiation, there was a level of religious scholarship that you had to do. You did not reveal that to outsiders. One of the most famous ones would probably be the Cult of Dionysus. Which is one of the later ancient Greek ones, and the Cult of Dionysus was all centered around, we often think like revelry and indulgence, but actually it had much deeper theological ideals, and it was more about the self, and again, death and rebirth. I think there's probably a lot of precursor to both Jesus and Mithras in the Cult of Dionysus, and I'm not the first person to say that by any means. um, but yeah, so a cult religion was, it's not a monotheistic thing. So cult religions and mystery cults, if you had a cult dedicated to Athena, for example, that's someone who had cults. Persephone probably had cults. It wasn't like, oh, I only believe in Persephone. Like Persephone is the only goddess that I think is real. It was more that of the pantheon, I am devoting myself to Persephone.
So it's kind of a little bit like how you have like fans and then like like I'm thinking like Swifties or like really into one specific artist, and it's like it's not that
Yeah.
they don't enjoy going to see other artists, but this is their favorite, and they will
Yeah.
go to much of as much of their shows as they can,
Mhm.
engage in as much as they can afford, talk to people who are
Mhm.
similar, like that kind of thing, where it's like it's not like you say, it's not monotheism, but it is a kind of like aligning yourself and announcing that or
Mhm.
being
It's
actively.
like devoting
Yeah.
yourself. Yeah. So essentially, like, you know, if you think about Rome, sort of, like first century BCE Rome, for example, there would have been a temple to all of the major gods, and then you would have had like a hearth goddess, you would have had like, somebody over your door, somebody over your bed, like you respected and worshipped all the different gods of the pantheon for their respective things. And the priests and acolytes and worshippers of those deities, it was like they were seen as being like the, again, a little bit like, in contemporary religions, the physical manifestations, the people who were given prophecy, who commanded the worship. And sometimes there was rivalry between, because there was a political aspect to this, but it was very much like there was a built-in hierarchy to the gods. Like, Jupiter and Juno are the mother and father, and then you have like Diana, who is like the daughter, and then I can't remember what the Apollo what the Roman version of Apollo is. It's just gone straight off my head. But yeah, like Mercury, you have these gods and goddesses who in the pantheon have their, like, how close are they to to the mother god and the father god. And then you have these little gods, you have demigods and things like that. So you worship them for all these different things, but the cult faith, the cult religions, these mystery cults, were fraternities, sororities, sometimes mixed gender, but it was very much these closed circles of initiates who usually were seeking mystic knowledge. And there was this idea that devotion to a specific deity might bring a sort of transcendence that was different to, the everyday worship, because worship was part of daily life. So that's where the context and the kind of ideas of cults come from. And I would say kind of think of the Cult of Mithras as like a precursor to the Freemasons, because it was leaning towards a monotheism, but it wasn't necessarily an outright rejection of the other gods. But what it was doing was allowing a certain level of leveling, a certain level of leveling. So in the same way that the Roman military was in some ways very egalitarian, no military is truly egalitarian and never will be. But the Roman military around the kind of like 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE was in particular becoming more and more egalitarian. You proved yourself by the merit of your conduct, and you could go from being a slave to being a general and being a chancellor or a counselor or something like that, or being an emperor, because it was all about merit. Never a true meritocracy in the same way it was never a true democracy. But the Cult of Mithras, though it had this inbuilt hierarchy, it was, if you were initiated into the cult, it was the secret handshake into that next level. And it does seem like there was an element of equality that the cult kind of offered in bringing together that military fraternity. Like, that, I think the closest thing I could think of in terms of, I was thinking like, what can I give as a sort of touch point? And it's probably the Freemasons. Obviously they are technically like a non-religious order, and they're kind of
Or are
almost
they?
religious. Well, or are they? Yeah, maybe they have the whole of the thing. But yeah, I would say kind of, if you trying to think, imagine it, kind of think of it like a late Roman version of the Freemasons, which works because they borrowed a shit ton of symbology and ideology from the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, so what were they actually doing? So we know that their place of worship were called Mithraeums. I was saying this wrong for years. I must have misread it because I was calling it a Mithraeum up until the point where I got to the London Mithraeum, stood in front of it and said to myself, that says Mithraeum, not
we've
Mithraeum.
we've all been there, like when you read stuff and you've not heard anyone say it and you read
Right?
it, and especially when you're like a fast reader, so often like you'll be reading so fast that you don't always necessarily take in the whole word, and you'll have a way of saying it in your head. And I know I've done this many times. We've all done this, and it's
Hmm.
nothing to be ashamed of. I think it just shows that you read a lot, and you know
I
life
happen to
is
not
for
have anyone
learning.
in my life that might have taught me how to say Mithraeum.
Yeah, yeah. But life is for learning, and
um,
you went to the Mithraeum,
exactly.
and then you
I
learned how
did.
it was pronounced.
I did. So, if you want to see what a Mithraeum looked like, you can actually go and see one, and I will shout them out at the end. But what we know is that Mithraeums in both the Persian tradition and the Roman tradition were subterranean, so they were underground. Usually long rooms, so kind of narrow but long. And at the far end of the room, there would be the sort of shrine to Mithras. You would have him in his Phrygian cap. You'd have him with the bull. Like I say, usually surrounded by different symbols that related to astrology, to the stars, to the idea of death and rebirth, to the idea of bringing light. There's some really great stuff about this in the London Mithraeum that I wish I'd have taken a photograph of so I could have remembered it for this episode. But I think I was just too awestruck. But that would be at the far end. There would be a kind of ritual bath at one side for you to kind of probably wash your feet, if not your whole body. Braziers, and they would have been dark, smoke-filled spaces. And you would have essentially have gone down into it, and we think there was some kind of initiation ritual, but it's unlikely that sacrifice was actually taking place. Animal bones and things like that have been found down there, but what we believe to have happened, or what at least scholars believe to have happened, is that there was a feasting ritual that was sort of designed around the sacrificial bull. So the initiation probably had something around, like there's kind of some idea that maybe the initiates wore the bull mask. And then the existing members had, we know that like what the 7 different hierarchies were, and we know that they all had different names relating to different planets and things like that, or different ideas within the story. But it's unlikely that they were actually sacrificing a bull. Now, particularly in Londinium, the Roman precursor to London, I don't know where they would have found a bull. They could, of course, have sacrificed like a ram or something like that. But what Roger Beck, one of the kind of main scholars of Mithras, and one of the primary voices in modern scholarship around this cult, suggests is that it was the cult meal that was taking place. And we know, according to Beck, and I'm quoting here, that the cult meal shared by the initiates on the banquet benches of their Mithraeum replicated the feast of Mithras and the sun god at a table draped with hide of the newly slain bull. So it's unlikely that any bull killing actually took place, but there probably was, like, you know, some kind of
The
like,
bull was probably killed prior to it, and then
yes,
things were prepared, so the
yeah,
kind of like tablecloths and then the food.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
or there was probably like a hide that like
mm.
was in the Mithraeum and you like ceremonially laid it out and things like that.
You bring out the
Um
yeah.
yeah. So we found Mithraeums in Italy, in Persia, in other parts of Europe, in London. And the frescoes that have been found, so there's benches that run all down the sides of these Mithraeums, do reveal kind of like some of the scenes of the initiation. Um, but it seems like they don't necessarily like replicate the story. The London Mithraeum kind of reimagines what might have happened down there, and there is a lot of argument. So Beck kind of does this thing where he's like, okay, here's the three things that we know for sure. And he argues that because the frescoes that have been found, particularly in the Capua Mithraeum, I hope I'm saying that right, Capua, it might be Capua, Capua, seem to almost definitely show you what the initiation was. He says that there's no real connection to the story itself. And so he doesn't, you know, some people have suggested that the initiate came in and he had to run around like the bull, and like, you know, there was all of this kind of like drama to it. And he says he like that's probably not what happened. And having been in the Mithraeum in London, it's not huge. So it would have been quite a tightly packed space, I think. So yeah, unlikely that there was any actual kind of like reenacting, but it was probably more likely that there were parts of the initiation that were meant to symbolize those main ideas. Beck also points to, why do I keep picking topics where I have to say the name of like Roman historians?
Yeah.
porphyry. I think it's porphyry.
Okay.
Porphyry. Porphyry, maybe porphyry. Who knows?
Your guess is as good as
Probably,
mine.
probably lots of people, and I
Yeah.
could have probably checked. It didn't occur to me. Sorry. So there are accounts of Mithras worship and Mithraeums in Porphyry's writings, particularly in De Antro Nifrarum, number 6. That basically it's like the descent and the exit of souls, so like the going underground, the doing of the ritual, and the coming back up again. And that there was the darkness was meant to symbolize like the darkness of the universe, and then Mithras like bringing light to it. And yeah, basically that there's a lot of stuff around, like I said, the celestial bodies, the cosmos, the idea of the universe, astrology, and like things coming into being. So porphyry basically suggests that it's that kind of like descent and exit idea, like the coming into being and the kind of like explosion of light and things like that. And Beck suggests that there is plenty of evidence from actual excavated exemplars showing that Porphyry and his sources, because he didn't actually see them, were quite correct about the design of the Mithraeum as a cosmic model. So there's
Interesting.
definitely this idea of like the universe, the cosmology, the celestial bodies, what they represent, and that life comes from them. So there seems to be this idea that like life is coming from the heavens. And again, that's not the same as Christianity, but that, in like the Greek tradition, for example, the gods live on like the highest point. And there is a heaven space, so to speak, but it's not necessarily a celestial
Yeah,
space.
it's like the top of a mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that yeah, where which is very different to kind of imagining a heaven beyond the firmament, because that's the thing, isn't it? Like the firmament, which is
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
is in Genesis, so it is
Mm-hmm.
this concept of a firmament is quite an old concept that would have been in lots of different traditions, but it's that like
Yeah.
you know, you have the bottom earth, obviously you had stuff beneath that maybe, but then you had the
Mm-hmm.
sky and then the firmament, and that was it. Whereas
Yeah.
here you have like more of a, well, what's beyond that, and maybe heaven or the skies and space, maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's not just all in the sky and the firmament, but maybe it's bigger. And also you have these, you know, gods, deities that maybe live in a different space as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
up a mountain.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So again, we know in some ways a lot and in some ways a very little about the worship of Mithras. I guess what we don't know is the deeper theology.
Hmm.
We have certain ideas in terms of what's taken from the Persian tradition, what's been found by archaeology. But because there's no writings, there's no religious doctrines, there's no accounts. Like the whole thing about cult religions is that it is that kind of oral learned tradition that you are initiated and then the secret knowledge is given unto you. um Scientology. um uh so we don't know about the theology in the way that we might know about in the way that we know, for example, about early Christian theology. Like we do know a lot about early Christian theology because either people like Porphyry are writing accounts. So we have the accounts of street preachers. We have the accounts of, this is what this person was saying on the street corner. And then obviously the Bible.
Yeah, well, what you don't have is
Yeah.
Mithraeans writing letters to each other, kind of talking
No.
about, like you say, like theological dogma and all these kinds of like, doctrine and practices, and like, what do we think about this? And it's all,
Hmm.
there's no letters, there's nothing
Yeah,
written down. It's
exactly.
all kind of like you go to your meetings and you have your rituals, and you can talk to your fellow Mythrites, but you don't write anything down. And maybe
Yeah, basically.
you paint a mural, but
Yeah,
that's
or
it.
you like carve a fresco or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I said, it was particularly popular amongst soldiers, and the excavation of the Mithraeum in London suggests that that was very much the case here in Britain, and that the worship of Mithras was quite popular in the Roman city of Londinium. So, the Mithraeum in London was likely built around 240 AD. It's now restored to its original location. It was first kind of found upon in the 19th century and then sort of forgotten and lost for a while, and then rediscovered in I think the 1940s or 1950s, as a lot of Roman architecture was, either in the course of the Second World War or after the Second World War, because when people were building the tube, when we were like building bomb shelters, all these types of things, laying foundations for shopping centres in the example of like the Nottingham caves, a lot of things were discovered. So the London Mithraeum is now you can visit it. It's free. They have a really fantastic selection as you first walk in of uncovered, like, just loads of amazing little architectural finds from Roman Britain, and Londinium in particular. You go obviously down the stairs, and as you're basically, it's free to go in, and you go into the first bit, and it's like a little museum room. They have these sort of like hologram almost light ups of um the Mithras image from the London Mithraeum, and they explain what all the different celestial bodies mean. They explain, the killing of the bull and the idea of of the bull killing thing that I've already forgotten
Yes.
how to say. And then they also do this storytelling bit. So they kind of retell the myth, and it's like, in the beginning there was darkness, and um all the things come into the world, and the birth of Mithras, and the slaying of the bull, and humans and life all coming down from the heavens. And it's a really beautiful way of, explaining the myth. They also have a lot of insight into the discovery of the Mithraeum, and they have a really great voiceover from Joanna Lumley, who
Hmm.
I just think is one of our national treasures. If you're a fan of Ab Fab, Joanna Lumley is just great, and I was quite happy to hear her voice. So again, really interesting both from a historical perspective and an archaeological perspective. You then go down into the Mithraeum, and they basically do a light, sound, and like smoke show. So they've built a platform into the center of the Mithraeum. The lights go down, and you know you can see mostly the foundation. Some of the fresco to Mithras is kind of saved, and what they've basically done is kind of create, I think it must be like some kind of translucent plastic with lights in it, but they've sort of filled it in so that you can see like where it would have been. But you go down into the Mithraeum, so you can see the foundations of the Mithraeum, you can see the benches, you can see where the like the font of water would have been. And then they sort of imagine what the kind of ritual meal would have been like. And you can hear the sounds, and there's the, because they said, it probably would have been very smoky, it would have been very dark. And it's just like a couple minutes, but it's a very fascinating kind of immersive experience to kind of put you into the idea of what it would have been like to step into the Mithraeum in the 3rd century in London. So would highly, highly recommend it. It's in the financial quarter, which I felt very out of place in. And it's tucked away under a Bloomberg building, but it's a fantastic place. Would really, really recommend it. So that is the kind of cult of Mithras. But you might be thinking, Lauren, this is a Gothic podcast. What the fuck? So, as I mentioned, Mithras and the Cult of Mithras has influenced texts that are either kind of like in the Gothic stratosphere, or the kind of like Gothic interconnected genres like fantasy. But it's also just one of those things, I think, that as a rival to Christianity, the Gothic has always been really interested in the idea of either what if Christianity wasn't the dominant religion, or what are the alternatives? That's why Druidism and the idea of pagan religions, particularly in the late 19th century, with people like Algernon Blackwood, kind of come up again and again and again. And I think particularly with the cult of Mithras or Mithraism, um, because it was largely a patriarchal religion, although scholar Jonathan David has pointed out that um, there's no archaeological or textual evidence to suggest that women were actively or explicitly excluded, and that female authored inscriptions have actually been found. And he claims that, we shouldn't just assume that it was a patriarchal religion. It was definitely militaristic, and it did definitely skew male, but he argues that there definitely were female initiates of Mithras, which I do find really, really interesting. And I think challenge an idea that the Gothic has been guilty of perpetuating, which is that cults and cult religions and cultic orders are either primarily male or have a female leader, like Rider Haggard, she, and then male sort of like worshippers and initiates. And the other thing that I think is kind of interesting and is more on the Gothic pop culture side of things, in that the Gothic has that very complicated relationship, particularly with Christianity, but with faith in general, is that in the 19th and 20th centuries, but mostly the 19th centuries, basically there was this theory that seems to have come from specifically, I believe his name is pronounced Charles Francois Dupois, who I believe is the originator of the Christ myth theory, which you may be familiar with. He essentially suggested that Christianity completely appropriated Mithraism, and that Jesus's, birth and rebirth, and him being the Son of God in the heavens, he essentially says that the whole myth of Christianity, he does this whole thing where he's like, and again, I'm quoting like from sources here, suggests that there's only that there's an absence of non-Christian historical records pertaining to Jesus, which I'm fairly sure is explicitly not true. But yeah, he basically uses Mithras and the Mithraic cult as the fuel for his fire in this idea that Christianity and the Christ myth is like a conscious construction, and that basically like they had to appropriate Mithraism in some way, and that they used the Mithraic cult and the mythology as like a template to build the myth around Jesus. This has been largely debunked. As I said, there is in fact significant historical, not super significant. Like we don't have like he's 5'7" and he's got brown eyes, but there is non-Christian historical sources that talk about Jesus.
Josephus is the main one,
Yeah.
as a kind of not really contemporaneous, but kind of contemporaneous, kind of like non-religious historical. Well, he's a historian, and he wrote about that period of Roman history, and I think it's the Antiquary or something like that. But Josephus,
Yeah.
and it's a similar kind of period to. There are similar.
Yeah.
You can trace things in the story of Jesus that appear in religious texts like the Gospels,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously were also written like at the earliest probably 30 years afterwards,
Yeah.
but probably more
Because
like 60 to 90 years afterwards.
Josephus
But there are,
writes about
yeah, you can,
baptism as well, doesn't he?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
these were real figures.
But there
Um,
are I mean, it's the same thing as, like, the flood myth. There are lots
yeah,
of flood myths, like the flood that you get in Genesis with Noah. Um, there are lots of other religions and traditions in that kind of period that have similar flood myths. It's not a unique thing. And there's lots of things
yeah,
about the Jesus story that relate to kind of him not just being a historical person that probably did exist in some way and probably was going around
mhm,
and being some kind of religious leader, or religious speaker, but the aspects of that character, as it were, be
mhm,
the wise men, the star that leads the wise men. Again, you have that
mhm,
astrology there, the prophecy, which are often retroactively kind of read in, but being born in
yeah.
December the 25th. There's lots of, and also that idea of birth and resurrection. Like, these are not. There's actually loads. There's loads of
Well,
contemporaneous, earlier kind of figures that
yeah,
all have
like,
those kinds of things.
yeah, Dionysus, Hercules,
Mm.
like
Yeah,
Mithras is not the first,
yeah,
and as in the Roman Mithras, and Jesus is not the first. So even though Depois theory was like largely bunked, it had significant effect in culture and pop culture, in literature, and you can trace a lot of these ideas in um obviously ideas around control of worship. So like his whole thing was that the myth around Jesus has been constructed to control worship and to therefore control people. So this whole idea of religion being used to control people has been closely tied to the Christ theory. But what's really fascinating to me is that like the Mithraic tradition was an actual cult with people in masks doing rituals underground. So if you think about like when we talked about like the satanic panic and things like that, the Mithraic tradition is probably the last big one in the European kind of like dawn of Christianity, where actually, yeah, there were people like underground, maybe doing sacrifices, though probably not, but definitely like, performing these rituals, having these revels. And I think it's really interesting that so much of the Gothic cult imagery, it really like matches up with the Mithraic cult imagery. And again, they weren't the first. The cult of Dionysus, for example, as I said, one of the huge ones that we do know about. Um, but yeah, it's just really fascinating. And just to finish, like I said, so in 1882, Ernest Renan basically said, you know, these two religions were rivals, and that Mithraism was so significant and so dominant that it could have become the dominant religion. And he said, and I quote, "If the growth of Christianity had been arrested by some mortal malady, the world would have been Mithraic." And there's nothing the Gothic loves more than an alternative history.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
What an yeah. I mean, what an excellent point to end on. Us all just thinking about that alternate reality where we're all, going underground, putting on our masks, and having some kind of smoky ritual.
mhm,
I think, yeah,
mhm.
interesting, interesting.
Yeah, I think especially because Mithras seems to have kind of been ascribed some of the qualities of the demiurge and perhaps been interpreted through the story of the demiurge, and then the demiurge became such a central concept in Gnosticism. And the Gothic in particular has been really interested in the idea of Gnosticism, particularly in the kind of late 19th into the 20th and 21st century. Um, if you don't know about Gnosticism, it is a really fascinating concept. Another one where actually I remember asking my RE teacher in like year 8 what it was be called if I wasn't religious, but I was maybe spiritual or like believed in something. And she was like, "Oh, agnostic." And like it means like knowledge or whatever. And I then remember going and looking up Gnosticism and being like, "Whoa, this is fucking crazy. Like, there's a powerful divine being coming from an egg, and he's flawed, and that's why the world is flawed, because he's an imperfect reflection. So yeah, if you want another episode about Lauren's teenage obsessions through the eyes of grown up Lauren the researcher, let us know. We'll do one on narcissism.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Lauren. This has been another fabulous episode. I'm sure there's lots of people listening or watching that have also enjoyed it. So if you have, please do like or comment. We really enjoy getting your feedback. And as Lauren said, if you have any topics that you want us to
Any more
dive
cults?
into the new year, then please do get in touch. We are getting close to the end of the year, so we will be having some festive-ish
Yeah,
episodes.
that was why we decided to do Mithras now, because
Yes.
even though, like we say, the Christ myth thing has been completely debunked, for a while people thought that maybe Mithras was like a precursor to Christ, or like they appropriated him. So I thought this was a good time to do it,
I
because,
think so too. Yeah.
end of the year, death and rebirth, like it's very Mithraic, as Renan
It's
would say.
yes, it is the season. So yeah, get in touch with us if you want us to look into any topic in the new year. Look out for our festive-ish episodes coming up. And yeah, I guess until next time, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.